What is up, everybody? My name is Richard Terrell. I go by Kirby Kid, and you are watching DO Live. Sometimes we actually talk about things that are not video games, and this time we are going to talk about narrative design. And not exactly narrative design, but half and half of narrative and systems, or thinking in systems. So we got a lot of cool things I want to show you, and hopefully it's not going to take too long. But the impetus of this whole discussion comes from this book that I'll show you. Boop-a-doot-doot-doot-doot. Boop. Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella H. Meadows. This book was fantastic, and this book gave me a lot of language and a lot of interesting ways to think about systems. And because of that, I started to apply that lens to other things, including game production and game design and narrative design. So we're going to take a little sort of theoretical trip into how thinking in systems helps us understand narratives. We're going to pop around a lot of different things, but the primary subject that I want to focus on is two very important scenes from the Disney film, The Little Mermaid. So it's one of my favorite Disney films, and to help me out, I got two people on the mic. I got Adrian and I got Bleach. Both of them have seen The Little Mermaid, so a lot of that is going to go much more smoothly, but you guys can say hi if you feel like it. Do so now. Cool. Never talk again. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so we're going to start with this basic idea that I'm going to put right here. So, like, stories as systems. Interestingly enough, thinking in systems has a, where is it? Here. Apparently there's a PDF online if you want to read it. Highly recommended. I listened to the audiobook. It was really good. But one cool thing about this is it gives us a glossary, and I am a big fan of glossaries as long as you can find them. Where is it? There. So let me just quickly define, as she defined, what a system is. Right here. Let's zoom in so it's nice and readable. Oh, I forgot to unmute the desktop audio, so you guys can say hi again if you feel like it.
Hi.
Anyway, a system is a set of elements or parts that is coherently organized and interconnected in a pattern or structure that produces a characteristic set of behaviors, often classified as its function or purpose. Purpose. I should not say that like the ghost figure from Samurai Jack. Anyway, so that's what a system is. It's kind of a broad term. We use system to define a whole lot of things, from our thermostat system in our houses to our economic systems to our governmental systems to our body endocrine systems and all these other kind of systems. But it's just a really well defined it's a well put definition that defines what a system is. We're looking for things that have parts. They are coherently organized. We're not talking about randomness. We're not talking about things like that. When we're talking about that they're interconnected. So that kind of goes hand in hand with being organized. But if they weren't interconnected, they could just be organized and separate. And we are not talking about that. They got to be in a pattern or a structure. Two are kind of interchangeable right there. But the important part is they have to produce a characteristic set of behaviors. And these behaviors are often classified as its function and purpose. Now here at from Critical Gaming and now Design Oriented, we talk a lot about game design. We talk about how things sometimes have a primary function and a secondary function. We talk about the intent or the purpose of various rules and various elements of design to better understand what it can do, what it's trying to do, and maybe where it can go. This definition of system still encapsulates all of that nicely. There is no sort of unneeded or unwanted overlap, and we can use this as a really good jumping off point to move further in this discussion. So that's what a system is, and what I really enjoyed about some of this language is some of the new terms that I never had words for, like stock, an accumulation of material or information that is built up in a system over time. Systems like to collect stuff. Now we have a word for it, stock. Self-organization is the ability for a system to structure itself or create new structures to learn or diversify. This is cool when talking about companies or cultures or economic systems, but really self-organization is not going to apply for us talking about the craft of fiction. The story isn't going to write itself. We can move on a little bit. The ability of a system to recover from perturbation and the ability to restore or repair or bounce back after change. Resilience, right? This is an important one. It's the ability for a system to stay itself and its essential parts and to produce its essential behaviors. There's got to be a certain level of resistance that it has to change. Nonlinear relationship, a relationship between two elements in the system where the cause does not produce a proportional straight line effect on the effect. This is what makes a lot of things complicated. When people can't draw a direct line between I do this, I get that, things get crazy. We talked a lot in game design terms about linear and nonlinear design, what the nature of linearity is, what's the nature of more emergent design and all that. This fits in nicely, nothing to tweak or add. And limiting factor, a necessary system input that is one limiting the activity of the system at a particular moment. So sometimes the system can do something, an input that limits, or it's a system input. It doesn't have to necessarily come from the system, but it limits how things are working within that system. So we just call these limiters or whatever, but it's an important concept. Hierarchy, systems organized in such a way to create a larger system, subsystems within systems. This is when things get really stacked. But here's probably one of the last good terms. Flow, material or information that enters or leaves the stock over a period of time. And the dynamics is what they call the behavior over time of a system or any of its components. It's a little different from how we use it, but good enough. And that's cool. So that's enough for definitions. We got a general idea of how our language lines up with her language, and we're going to do some pretty cool stuff with that. So one of the first points I want to make is thinking of stories as systems. Now, sometimes people think of stories as just whatever comes out of their mouth. People think of stories as a whole bunch of different mediums, from TV shows to podcasts to graphic novels to oral stories and to movies to video games and just about everything else. But it's interesting to think about stories as systems, as being an interconnected, related group of parts that exhibit a certain property and then have certain characteristics and a certain level of resilience from being changed. That's really cool because it gives us a different way of understanding how to reach our goal. And if our goal is writing good stories or telling good stories or being an effective communicator, thinking like this can really help us. So I think one thing that's kind of shocking about thinking of stories as systems is that in order to better understand systems, which is something that was mentioned many times in the book, you have to recognize that some parts are more important than others. Some parts are key. Some things actually trigger the ebb and flow of the flow, which affects the stock, which is just a collection of stuff. Some things have a direct relationship, and some things have a nonlinear relationship. And understanding that each attempt to change the system can have various effects. Each element in the system can have various effects, and trying to get the desired output can be either easier or harder depending on how you approach that. That is why the world is complicated. So thinking of stories as system means we're already entering the discussion assuming a certain level of complexity. And I think one interesting thing is, if a story requires, let me just start typing. Boop. 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 Stories kind of require a structure, and we can recognize certain elements within that structure as being sort of the most important elements. Characters, perhaps, plot, maybe, certain parts of the setting, but not all parts. Not every detail about your character is super important. We can think about plot as outside factors or inputs, right, that give the player motivation, an impetus, some reason to move or act or do whatever. And we can think about stock as a flow of information, right? The reader needs to get XYZ information. Stock equals story bits. The reader needs to get a certain amount of information at a certain amount of time to even understand what's going on. You can't just reference random characters. You can't just drop random names or do random things and expect the reader to follow along. It's got to be, they have to have a certain amount of introduced knowledge in order to even have a chance, right? We can talk about resilience, where if you want to change your story, there are certain things that will have a much greater effect on the end behavior or function, right? And if the function, which I probably should write, is to clear communication of an idea, that's kind of what we're thinking about of what a story is. So it's interesting, right? Some of the ways that we analyze systems is identifying what the feedback loops are, what the inputs are, if there's hierarchies, which things rely on other things, what the relationships are between those things, and so on and so forth. So we have all these elements working together, but there are some times when we interject something or want to change something that is intended to have a desired effect on the outgoing system. And sometimes if you pick the wrong thing, it has absolutely no effect. And sometimes you think you're going to change a small thing, but it has a great effect. The interrelated connectedness of parts is what creates all that potential complexity. The way that any one part can relate to another part and not relate as strongly to another part or not relate at all to some of the other parts creates this crazy web of interconnected rules. And when rules work together, we get a lot of specific, varied results. And when the results are varied, it's harder and harder to see how changing one thing can affect the end result. But when we read stories, we get the end result. We get the, we'll say, it's the dynamic stock, to use the language that was from the book. So dynamic is basically, we'll go back to it, the behavior over time of a system, any of its components. So when you're reading a story, you're getting bits of information, and as you read, has the words hit you? Change over time. You kind of experience the story about this aspect, and what you take away are these aspects, right? The stock. So that's why the experience of reading a story can be thought of as a dynamic stock, experiencing the dynamic stock. So anyway, so what we learn from thinking like this is that a lot of times when people either talk about stories or want to give advice about, narrative, they never talk in a way that reflects this kind of complexity. I think sometimes, so let's go back to the CED system, which is a system I created for talking about stories, and this essentially breaks things down into a certain level of a hierarchy, right? So we have content, we have execution, and we have discourse. And content includes all the basic stuff, like character, setting, plot, and theme, and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, this system was used in order to help people zero in on some of the core parts, the bits, if you will, the content. And to really have a really basic understanding of what's going into the story, because after you identify the parts, how they interconnect, it gets super complicated. It's enough to write a really complicated book about systems and how our lives are dominated by systems, and it's really it's why giving advice is so difficult. You could say, like, oh, this character said this thing. Why don't you have them say something else? Why don't you have them use a sword instead of a nunchuck? Why don't you have them go to this place? Or why did this happen? A lot of those suggestions could either have a great effect on the dynamic stock, the experience of what the user experiences in the end, or it could have almost no effect. And understanding those differences is what's really hard. So let's take a look. And let me know, guys, if I need to clarify anything, right, as I go along.
It might be a separate topic altogether. One was between clear communication or what you wrote for function versus direct storytelling, because that's come up a couple times in some of our past chats.
Okay, so I can put here the manner in which you tell your story is that's a matter of execution, and you can be there's many ways to so bits of information in themselves are obviously information bearing, but readers use a lot of their experience to get more information out of the bits, right? That's how basically all of our social cues and context is all just based on experiences we have. And if somebody makes a social faux pas, like they don't have to say in the story, and everyone thought that it was a social faux pas. All you have to do is basically describe the context, and people who are familiar with that culture or that situation can easily be like, that's embarrassing. I don't want to be that person, so on and so forth. So in terms of getting the idea across, the plot, whatever, would involve character embarrasses themselves. But how you tell that, how you get that information across, can be the difference between directly saying something and we'll call it indirectly saying something. And that's kind of an interesting thing to bring up, because if a system has a bunch of bits and the really magical, amazing, complicated, useful part of systems is that they exhibit these behaviors. This is function. Behaviors, they exhibit these behaviors, and these behaviors characterize the entire system, but no one part of the system can basically necessarily has that same characteristic. So that's why that's what the amazing part about systems. So if stories are systems, what you want to do, if the end result is, let's see, if the end result from telling a story is reader has 100 facts broken down into X amount of character knowledge, Y amount of setting knowledge, Z amount of plot, and E, I just picked a random letter, amount of theme. And then the reader also understands enough about the plot to arrange this in chronological order, right? If the only purpose of the story was to make sure that the reader walks away with a list of independent facts that they can put together on their own time, people wouldn't like reading and people wouldn't like listening. So the amazing part about story design and storytelling is that you deliver a bunch of simple low-level things, individual words, individual sentences, very simple statements that everyone understands and nobody gets lost. But then as they experience more and more of this information, delivered in a somewhat linear fashion or a very linear fashion, they experience this sort of characteristic about the whole thing that isn't sort of found in any particular word or small part of the book. It's actually the entire experience of basically experiencing the whole thing as a unit, right? So basically what I'm saying is, if systems have a magical element and you want your storytelling to be magical, you should probably use the magical element of the systems in order to get that done. And that's basically the difference between directly trying to tell someone the facts or understanding the structure of the system and letting the magic happen. That's actually a really good point. So now we kind of have a really interesting way to understand any particular craft or creative fiction writing sort of suggestion, idea, theory, whatever, from this kind of framework. So what do I want to say? Oh, so the way I just described the magic of systems and the magic of storytelling, it's basically, I can write it right here if you guys want to see it on the screen. The magic of systems / storytelling is consuming / experiencing the simple, individual, or low-level parts, information-bearing parts. So, like, remember the definition of systems and how a set of elements or parts that coherently organized? This is what I mean by parts of your story need to be information bearing. It's got to tell us about the characters, the setting, the plot, or the theme, or it shouldn't even be in there, right? For the most part. So when I say here, information bearing, this is just coherent. Experiencing these low level parts that through the careful, controlled delivery of information. Remember what we called the delivery of information before? Flow. Stock is the information, right? Like accumulation of stuff. And then flow is material or information that enters or leaves. Kind of an interesting way to think about that. So through the careful controlled delivery of information, flow, that through the careful delivery, allow the reader to experience the dynamic characteristics of that stock. Allow the user to experience the dynamic, which I'll just put in caps. I'll put this in caps. The dynamic, sort of more than the quote-unquote sum of its parts characteristic, right? Dynamic characteristic of the system, which is essentially equals the words and their order / structure. Okay. So I, studied creative writing in college. That's my major. A lot of times we talk about the magic of fiction and the magic of storytelling and how everyone knows you can get lost in the book and you can no longer are consciously thinking that you're reading the words on the page and all you're doing is imagining stuff, and it's like watching a movie in your head, and the way that your brain is relating to the content is drawing from your own experiences. So there's a level of sort of believability and realism there for that aspect, and when you willingly suspend your disbelief, you're able to experience something. That's why we love stories, right? So this is a different way of describing the same thing, but this one is rooted in the language of systems. You consume all the simple, individual, low-level stuff in a very coherent, specific way that allows you to experience the overarching characteristics of the system, right? That's magical. It's the same. Now here, if all this is true, and all this is kind of true, we have a really interesting takeaways. One, just like I implied and explicitly said, which I'll show you over here, actually, critical gaming. I'll pause this. So this is my old design blog, critical gaming with a hyphen, design 101, organizing information to help people understand many aspects of game design from the simple concepts on upwards. And you can see storytelling and story design is 8 on the list. I wrote this series called Story Design Storytelling, and the title should really be Story Design is Telling. And what I was trying to convey in this article is that you can have all the same content, right? All the same characters, plot, setting, themes, but how you deliver that, whether directly, indirectly, or otherwise, however you want to describe it, is what creates the impact that you probably are going for, the magic of storytelling, the delivery, if you will. So this whole series, defines the CED system. It talks about examples in every single thing, like theme, complexity, simplicity, plot. Just giving more examples so people can understand those terms. This one talks about execution, and the different ways that you can take the content and execute on it to deliver very different effects. And then after establishing all the basic foundation, figuring out what you like in a story is not the same as determining what is good about its design and craft. Blah, blah. The order is content, execution, then discourse. Oh, so here's interesting. I bold things that are important. You should too. So let me take a drink. I said we all have our preferences. Some like stories with believable characters. Others love complex narratives. It's helpful to know what your preferences are. Knowing helps us anticipate and deal with our biases. Beyond personal preferences, the facets of the CED system are not all weighted equally. It's simple. For a story to be good, it needs to have components that work together. It's like by the way, I wrote this article in 2011, right? 8 years ago. Then it needs to present these components so that the audience can understand the story, preferably in the first encounter execution. Finally, it's icing on the cake for a story to be unique, creative, or consistent with other works in the world. To sum up, the order is content, execution, and then discord. Imagine a pyramid structure with content as the base. Here is where things get real. Whew. Take a breather. If you have any questions, do so now, because I need to breathe.
No questions, just processing all this. Taking some notes.
Cool. Let me just boop. Okay. I want to keep. I'll keep scrolling through this. So blah blah. I explain that in more detail. I contrast things with the complex Metal Gear Solid and the simple Katamari. Contrasting the complex Killer 7 with the simple Shadow of the Colossus. Contrast. This is a poem I wrote about starfish. Zach Gorman comic talked about more complex concepts like co-authoring, avatar, viewer, directors, all this other kind of stuff to kind of understand and have a better language for talking about stories in video games. But ultimately, I talk about the whole story versus gameplay thing and why that dichotomy is not very helpful and not very useful in the long term. Pokemon stuff. Talked about ludonarrative dissonance and the buzzword that people tossed around. Just more and more conclusions about how the story design concept gets applied to video games. But what we're looking for now is more in general the craft of fiction. So let me pop back over here. Here is where things get interesting. So I pulled a bunch of quotes from Thinking in Systems, and there's many more quotes to grab, but these are the ones that I have. And I gotta show the Discord channel, right? Or do I? I can't zoom in on Discord, can I? Well, then it's useless. I'll just read it and I'll put it on the screen. The first quote from the book, which we will keep rolling along here. Insight comes not only from... Oh, can you guys read that? Insight comes not only from recognizing which factor is limiting, but from seeing that growth itself depletes or enhances limits, therefore changes what is limiting. So basically, she's talking about some systems have growth in it, and things can't grow indefinitely. Sometimes you're going to run out of food, space, oxygen, whatever, and that itself is another kind of limiting factor. So the interplay between a growing plant and the soil, a growing company and its market, a growing economy and its resource is in itself dynamic. She's using the word dynamic to mean the change over time, the behavior over time of a system, and any of its components, right? So this is interesting because a lot of times people are like, what's the difference between a poem and a short story, and a short story that's like 1 billion words long, and a novel that's only 1,000 words long? What's the difference? What's the difference? And I think we're getting really close to understanding what the difference is. But this quote here would have us believe that as the system that you're working with, which in our case is going to be stories, as it grows, more words, more content, whatever, the limits of what it can do, and even what you do to it to achieve X effect, is going to in itself be changing. So maybe you write short stories like, I always leave it to where, I wrap up the ending with this crazy, like, zoom up into the clouds and then everything happily ever after, whatever. Well, that's neat for short stories. But this is saying, if you just decide to write a novel for whatever reason instead of a short story, that ending may not function the same as it did in a short story just because of the sheer volume. So another way of saying this is systems are complex for a lot of reasons. They exhibit a lot of behavior, and why they do and how they change is also complex. So even considering something as simple as the size of your story is no trivial matter. That's where that first quote is telling us. Here's another quote. Boo, boo. That's the sound of a quote. I didn't make it. When there are long delays and feedback loops, some sort of foresight is essential. To act only when a problem becomes obvious is to miss an important opportunity to solve the problem. Listen up, everybody. She's talking about feedback loops. She's talking about when a system can either recognize itself when things are going to be troublesome or wrong, or when things need to be replenished or whatever. And she's saying in order to even do that, when there's long delays between what you do and understanding how it came out, you have to have foresight, right? You have to have foresight, or else you're going to get to the end of your book and realize, I should have added an entire character. I'm at the end of my book because I didn't think this through. Now we have a bigger problem instead of a small problem, right? That's just an example, but think about it in those terms. The bigger your book gets, everyone knows the harder it is to keep track of your details. You need to keep track of your own details so you don't accidentally contradict yourself, and so you don't have to retcon things in the future, and so you can even just write more story based on the stuff you've written. That's all important, and that all becomes more difficult the bigger it is. And the reason why that becomes more difficult the bigger a story is because there's a delay between the content that you put into a story and understanding what its effect is going to be. Like, you could say that you write a story and you have no idea how good it is until you finish the first draft, and then you realize what it is. You could say that the feedback you get is only when other people read it, because you're in your own head. You can't get a really objective or clear perspective. Or you could just say that the feedback, it's just hours or days long when chapters long, right? Like, you write in chapter 3, and then in chapter 6 you're like, now I understand why chapter 3 needs to be chapter 3. Regardless of which one of those you think is most appropriate for whatever storytelling system that you're currently thinking about, foresight is essential. It is not optional, essential. Now, another way... Yeah, go ahead, or Bleach.
Can I ask a question?
Do it.
What does it mean by feedback loops in terms of a book?
Okay, so... a system, that's a good question. A system, when we're talking about this, metaphor, this bridge we're trying to make, has feedback loops, and they are mechanisms. It's a rule or information flow or signal, right? Information flow, as in things getting put into the book, right? Adding more content. A rule, information, or signal that allows a change in a stock to affect a flow into or out of that same stock, right? What this basically means for a book is adding stuff into the book that meaningfully adds to what I consider to be the coherent, meaningful content, which is the story you're building. A closed chain of causal connections from a stock through a set of decisions and actions dependent on the level of stock and back again through the flow of stock. Like this, I feel like the feedback loop in this case is exclusively from writer to story and not from any other thing. So as you're writing it, you read what you write, you know what you just wrote, and then you have the task of putting in more content. When you put in more content, it's going to be reflective of what you just wrote. Therefore, you could say that there is well, there's an injection of information that's already flow. You're adding stock or content to the story. And then how you respond to what you have, I believe, is our best metaphor for what a feedback loop might be. You write a story, you introduce a character, the character does something, you mention that character again, and then you're like, that character's cool, I'm going to have that character do this, and then that, and then the character keeps reappearing in your story because a story is a series of causal events, and sometimes the things you add continue to influence the other things that you add, and the story becomes about that character, so on and so forth. Hopefully that's a clear enough example.
I kind of get it.
Stuff you add to the story, and you being aware that you're adding stuff to the story. I think that's our best bet. Okay. So here's just another quote about systems. This is when she's talking about what happens when you're in a system, you want to change it, why change is hard, blah, blah, blah. She says change comes first from stepping outside the limited information that can be seen from any single place in the system and getting a better overview. Blah, blah, from a wider perspective, information flows, goals, incentives, and disincentives can be restructured so that separate, bounded, rational actions do add up to results that everyone desires, right? She's just saying when you step out of a system and get some real perspective, you can then therefore make a much better suggestion of change that could probably make everyone happy, is what she's saying. Key point is she describes the limited information that can be seen from any single place in the system. That's a very funny way of describing some of our own biases and perspectives that we have in writing a story. And if we're writing a story and all we're really concerned about is what's happening in this scene to this character as I'm writing it, that's a very limited perspective. And like we said before, foresight is a really good thing to have. What it's saying here is there's limits to what you can, there's a limit to how good your decisions can be when you have such a small perspective. So stepping outside, getting an overview and a wider perspective allows you to restructure things, right? So this is also speaking to the idea that a system is a collection of rules, but if a story is also a collection of bits, of story bits, this is saying you can't really step outside of the story until you understand where its boundaries are, right? So if you're writing a story as it goes along and just putting down whatever comes to mind, you don't have enough foresight about where the story is going or how it's going to end in order to step outside of it. So you really can't gain this kind of perspective unless from start to finish you kind of know where your story's going. Harry Potter. Maybe ending first writing. There's a quote about okay, so there's a quote from J.K. Rowling about how she knew what the ending of Harry Potter was going to be when she started writing it. I can't, if you guys want to Google to try to find that quote, feel free to do so because I have to move on. But there's this idea that I say all the time, and it's that when you write your story, you need to know what the ending is when you start writing it, basic idea. And you're like, well, how is that possible? The story can be long and blah, blah, blah. Now think about it like this. Think about it like this. If you know how the story is going to end, you have a total view of what the arc or the boundaries of your story is going to be. With that total view, when you start to write the story, you have the better perspective that you need to make better informed decisions. Also, because a system is a group of things that are well organized and coherent, working together. If you understand the end of the story when you start writing the beginning, that's when you have a really good idea of everything that's going to fit within your boundaries, right? So sure, you may not know exactly what the character's going to say. You may not know exactly what they're going to do, but because you have the structure, the skeleton, if you will, you have enough of an insight and a scaffold to make sure everything lines up much more reliably, right? But there's another curious thought in that, and I think it's going to come out more clearly when we start talking about stories as logical proofs. But just keep in mind that it's not a story until it has an ending. And it's not an argument until you have a conclusion that you're arguing for, right? I'll write that down so I don't forget. Not an argument until you have a thesis and conclusion. Not a story until you know where it's going to end. Okay. Another random quote. See, I like that these are kind of random quotes, but they're quotes I picked. But then if stories are really like systems anyway, all these should be semi-relevant. Let's see. Okay. So the final bunch of quotes is just talking about how to get around some really difficult restructuring and fixing problems when systems are involved. She calls these things archetypes, when these common problems that pop up because of system structures create these problems, and they pop up all over the place once you understand the underlying rules that give rise to them. There's a theory, an idea that I've been throwing around, and so I'll type it here. But it's basically, it's a proof. No, it's not a proof. Sequels are bad. The reason sequels are bad perhaps is trying to change the behavior of a system without changing the key elements, right? You want your characters to all be the same, but you also want them to do all new things. Those two things don't really go together, right? But more specifically, my theory was, in order to write a good sequel, the genre must change. Seems like a weird idea, right? Like, what are you talking about? You can certainly write a sequel in the same genre and keep everything going, right? Yeah, maybe. But again, sequels are bad, and we know this. Most sequels are bad. And whether or not it took a lot more talent to make a good sequel in that same style or not, here's why I think my theory here is super insightful. If stories are like systems, then they have a certain behavior. Stories are systems. They have a character / behavior. This behavior is emergent. The behavior is emergent and dependent on specific elements and the structure. That's complex, right? Not just the stuff you put into it, but how it's arranged. Writing a sequel inherently erases the structure, so that's already half hard. But specifically, we know from systems to change. Well, she talks a lot about how hard it is to change systems from within and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's probably the same reason why it's hard to write a sequel. If you don't change enough of the right things, it's only going to fall into the trap of having the same behavior, but probably being much worse for it. And that's why a lot of systems are bad. By changing the genre, the structure changes, giving the content enough flexibility for the new context to harmonize instead of contradict. I'm not going to go too much into this, but that's just a really interesting way of interpreting why so many sequels are bad. It's because they're trying to make a sequel instead of trying to write a new story with some of the same content. And the reason why you can't just change the structure of a thing and keep the content the same is... It scrolls down slowly. Quote here. Boom. Hierarchical systems evolve from the bottom up. The purpose of the upper layers is to serve the purpose of the lower layers. We're talking about systems and subsystems and hierarchical systems and how some systems create super systems by organizing smaller systems and systems, right? This explains why sequels are bad. The bottom was supposed to be served by the structure on top of it. If you just rip out the structure on top and try to replace it with a new plot or whatever, or a new sequence of scenes and events, it's not going to evolve from the content. It's being shoved in spite of the content, right? And that's why so many things don't line up and so many things don't make sense and blah, blah, blah. So many problems with sequels it's explained right here in this statement. That's pretty groundbreaking right there. I'll pause and give you guys a chance to ask questions and stuff.
Maybe I'm looking at this wrong, but it confuses me. Shouldn't the lower layers be serving the purpose of the upper layers?
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me just let's see. Upper layers of the hierarchy. We'll go to the book itself. Upper layer of layers of the... Okay. Where is this quote? Hold on. Evolve from the bottom up. Cool. No. Okay. Let's see what we can pull out here. What you need to think about may change over time. As self-organizing systems evolve, new degrees of hierarchy and integration. The energy of nations were once almost completely decomposable, once one from another. That is no longer true. You can watch self-organizing systems form hierarchies, right? A self-employed person gets too much work and hires some helpers. A small, informal nonprofit organization attracts many members and a bigger budget. And one day the members decide, hey, we need someone to organize all this. A cluster of dividing cells differentiates into special functions and generates a branching circulatory system to feed all the cells and the branching nervous system to coordinate them. So it's kind of saying when systems grow, sometimes they create new systems in order to serve the purpose of the fact that there's too many of them. But that means the new systems are serving the lower systems. Hierarchies evolve from the lowest level up, from the pieces to the whole, from the cell to the organ to the organism, from the individual to the team, from actual production to the management of production. Early farmers decided to come together to form cities for self-protection and for making trade more efficient. Life started with a single cell, blah, blah, blah. This is something unfortunate that both the higher and the lower levels of the greatly articulated hierarchy easily forget. The original purpose of the hierarchy is always to help the originating subsystems do their job better, right? So she's saying it, and if you think about it, I think what you're saying, Bleach, is, hey, a hierarchical overarching system only exists because of the lower level ones. Therefore, one had to come from the other. Therefore, the one that was made last is probably more complex and harder to create. Therefore, it's cooler and we should value it more. And this is like flip that on its head. The only thing that matters are the content. Like a story is only its content. It's only its characters. It's only its setting. It's only the plot. That's it. The structure of the story, which we can consider to be its execution. Scroll up. This is the only thing a story is. But how you arrange it is only supposed to serve making these things really clear. No one really cares how clever you are and your wordplay, and you did your paragraphs like this, and every paragraph has exactly 400 characters, and nobody cares about any of that. What we cared about are characters. Characters don't exist in a vacuum, so they're in settings. We only care about people if they do stuff, and we extract meaning from people who do stuff. This is all that we care about. This is just the execution is supposed to get this to be as clear as possible in a way that creates super exciting experience to both experience it and to reflect on, like, the content, right? So that's a super interesting point that you bring up, Bleach. I think the conventional way of thinking about it is the overarching systems are the purpose, and like actually it's the lower level systems that are the purpose. It's what I was saying in my article series a long time ago. It's what she's saying in systems. It's why when I read this book, I'm like, psh, she's speaking my language. I came to all these same exact conclusions by just exploring the crafts of fiction, the game design, human behavior, language, all that junk. It's all the same. So that, yeah, go ahead.
I still don't understand, and it might take me a while to understand, but are we saying maybe that the layers on top have to be symbiotic? Like the lower level serves as the foundation, but the level above it also complements it? Because the whole of thinking of a pyramid would be like the pyramid sides are supposed to be straight, but if you take out just one layer and then just build up the rest of them, then it's not a pleasing whole.
For the pyramid example, that would be like, it's completely possible to build a pyramid that's way flatter to the ground, right? You can have your hallways, you can have them dig and lead underground, you can do all that stuff, but then you keep building upwards. Some for, aesthetic reasons, right? And some for functional reasons, and how all that worked. Pyramids may not be the best example. It's kind of a anomaly, world wonder anyway. But essentially what it's saying is, it's not just the higher level systems aren't symbiotic. They are, but they aren't symbiotic because that's just a style or a flavor that they choose. They're symbiotic because the only reason they exist is to serve the lower system in the first place. So to me, that's kind of like your arm, right? You wouldn't say that your arm is symbiotic to your body. It is part of your body. You wouldn't have your arm if you didn't have your chest and all that stuff, all the rest of your body. But it's not like it's this foreign member that you're like, now you will help me arm whenever I need it, right? Like, it's actually a extended part in a way of the body. So when hierarchical systems are made from self-organizing systems, they're just kind of like extensions, and that's why they're there primarily and only to serve what those lower level things are doing, because they made those extensions in the first place to do so, because they had to.
All right, I'll have to ruminate on that more. You may continue.
Mm-hmm.
For stories, what's an example of an upper level of the hierarchy serving the lower layers?
So it's common within fiction writing to experience or say something like, the story just wrote itself. You're like, did it? Maybe, right? Once you get the characters down, once you start the plot going, once you get maybe a certain way into your narrative arc, if you envision the beginning and the end before you started writing, at some point you're going to get to the halfway point and you're going to need to start diving down and things wrapping up. In a lot of ways, the story writes itself because the content that you put in is sort of exhibiting characteristics and behaviors, and they point to something, right? You have a whole story about like a person who is going to a family reunion, and you're like, well, I expect that person to eventually get to the family reunion, not start a career as a spy and go into other nations and blow stuff up. Like, that is completely antithetical to what was set up in the first half of the book. Like, we don't write stories just to make crazy left turns like that. We write stories so that what is established at the beginning makes sense and it's relevant and is put together by the end. In that sense, stories do kind of write themselves, because once you get halfway through the story, again, like I said before, you can't just add characters. You can't just do whatever you want. The story is already moving in a direction. So with that in mind, you could say that the execution of a story, how you're writing it, how the pacing of it, like the manner in which you're getting across this content, is a self-organizing hierarchical system where the only reason this execution is there is to try to get this content to come across clearly. And in a lot of ways, it has a mind of its own. In a lot of ways, it is everything that you write execution-wise is subject to how these things were set up in the first place. That's probably my best metaphor / analog to the hierarchical system.
It reminds me of something Hayao Miyazaki said one time. He said no matter how hard he tried to steer it away, let me give you a little context real first. He always starts with the storyboards first, and he just goes forward with it. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and he likes it that way because it's exciting. But eventually it gets to a point where he wants to do something, and he's comparing it to the story and the things he has already, and he realizes he can't, because all those elements are already in place and they can't really be changed.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. So maybe in general the self-organization concept doesn't have a direct analog to storytelling, but some of the things that we just considered, and the fact that what Bleach is just talking about was resilience, in a way where the story resists change and maintains its characteristic because certain things are set in place, and after a certain point you're like, well, can't change it. That may be a bit of a stretch, but we're going to move on anyway. Those are interesting things to think about. So that was an interesting look at thinking about stories in terms of being systems and not in terms of being emotion-carrying word clouds, but rather these characteristic emerging content stocks, right? Very different, very different. So after thinking about that, I was like, wait a minute. People don't typically think about stories like a logical proof, where you don't really have an argument for your logical statement until you kind of know where you're going. And you're saying, this is this. Now let me walk you through it. And you got your thesis, and then you got your conclusion. And then the logical steps are you slowly working out the individual's truth statements to get to that point. People just don't make arguments without a point to it. They don't just start arguing and go, I think my point is this, and let me keep going. Like, that doesn't really make sense. It's because when you feel like you have an argument, you feel like it once you have the beginning and the end sort of encapsulated. You're like, I think this because of this, and this, therefore this. Hey guys, I have an idea. And then you present like the whole thing as a chunk. That's why I said stories need to be considered, or you start writing stories when you have the beginning and the end, or where it's going in mind, because then you have a chunk and then you can start working it. So if you write a story more like a logical proof, you got to know where it's going when you start it. And then it's so much easier it's so much easier to consider that each sentence is in service of explaining the thesis, which is the point of the paragraph. And you string enough of those together and you get yourself a very convincing argument, right? So in some ways, storytelling and the craft of fiction isn't just a grab bag of all these cool details you like. Ooh, I like the color red. Let me talk about something red in the scene. Ooh, it's cold. Brr. I want to talk about how cold he is. What else can I talk about? Like, it's not storytelling. That's just random junk. That's lack of coherence. So in a way, the reason you're writing a paragraph in the first place, or you can think about so many aspects of storytelling in terms of, I need people to know where they are. I'm going to write a paragraph so they understand what the setting is. And if you think efficiently, like, I'm going to name it, I'm going to describe it, it's quick history in a sentence, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to get out, right? Super efficient. I need my reader to understand this main character is this. I'm going to name him, I'm going to show him doing something, plot or whatever, and then I'm going to quickly support it with this, this, and this, and then get out, right? And the paragraph is done. I don't think people think like that, even though typically when we write in paragraph form, we've kind of internalized from reading enough and talking enough how to chunk things into groups. But thinking about them as proofs and thinking about them as logic statements is a really clean way of understanding what you're doing without cluttering your story's ability to sort of do this high level stuff like this. So when I give people advice, or when I think about giving people advice, all I'm thinking is completely within these structures, right? Breaking down the stuff into the CED system, observing their overall structure, and then describing the behavior I see, telling them about the limitations. I usually talk about limits all the time, like, this can't do this because of this. That's a limit, right? That's not just, I like the color red, I think you should add more red into it. That's, your story cannot do this if you continue to do this. Much more complex, much more systems driven. And that's how I think about things. But other people, obviously not everybody thinks in these crazy theories, but sometimes it makes it very difficult to talk about stories because everyone's coming at them from different directions. Oh, geez. So I'll quickly touch on the problems right here. The problems. Sometimes you ask people to tell you about their story. You're like, hey, man. Hey, girl. What up? Tell me about your story. And then they just immediately start telling you, chapter 1, first sentence. He was the boy that lived on the the first opening sentence of Harry Potter? I don't have it memorized. Did anybody find that J.K. Rowling quote about how she had the ending of Harry Potter in mind when she started writing it?
Not really. There was various articles and interviews that kind of touched upon it in a general way, but nothing that specific.
Cool. Whatever. So yeah, some people just immediately start telling you their story, and they just tell you the story like, this character is this. They went to this school. They are coming at it from this, and they went from this side area. And then here's what happens. They step into a city. I'm like, you're telling me the story. You're telling a story. I was asking about what your story's about, right? Theme is a little abstract, and I don't want to necessarily say that theme is... I always think of theme as being a content, right? It's the stuff you put in your story so that when people say, what is some characters in your story? You tell them characters. What's some settings? You tell them settings. What's your story about? You tell them what it's about. It's content. It's not this magical, mystical thing that emerges from the execution. It's actually stuff you put into it. So when I'm asking people for theme and they tell me story, I wonder, like, do you know what your story is about? And the reason why that's interesting and somewhat concerning is that if you envision a story from start to finish, and you're thinking in that mindset, you live your life and all of a sudden you're like, oh shoot, what the? Still streaming? Cool. It's like, oh shoot. And then you think back on what just happened in your life, like the reason that I wound up in this situation is because I took the bus. It's because my car broke down. It's because I decided to be mean to a person and I wasn't paying attention on the road. And now the person that I met on the bus is the same person I was mean to, and they taught me how that I was a jerk, basically. Like, that's a whole story. But the only reason that's a whole story is because from the very beginning, angry person, mad on the road, yelling at person, distracted, gets in car accident. In the very end, meets person that distracted them, learns a little bit about their perspective and understands they're a jerk, is a complete arc, right? You don't need anything more to convey that idea, that theme. And the theme could be remorse. The theme could be like being eye-opening, seeing the other side, reflection. Any of those themes could be exhibited in that story. So if you ask someone like, what's your story about? And they say, on the first day, the person woke up and decided to do their makeup and their hair. And they're like, no. You have to tell me my story is about regret, remorse, reflection. Because that's how we think about things in real life, right? Like, if I say, tell me some stories about when you were sad, you quickly do this filter. And in your life, you go, I was sad here. I was sad here. Why was I sad? It's because I didn't get any candy. Why didn't I get any candy? Because I was 4 years old and I'm not in charge of my own diet. And then like so on and so forth, right? Like you can put the context together that makes the bookends of a story, beginning and end. And if you can do that just from a random prompt or random memories, you should also be doing that when you decide to make a story up from scratch. It's the same kind of thing. So when people can't tell me the theme, I'm like, then why are you writing a story? I don't understand. The whole wouldn't it be cool if, to me, it's not a reason. Well, it could be a reason, but to me, it's not why I write stories. Sometimes when I ask people, hey, where's your story going? What's the structure? And then they say like, oh, I write, and I never think ahead. I just write whatever I'm thinking about now. It's the problem we talked about before. You may not know where you're going. You may not have enough scaffolding to realize some scenes are much more important than others. And even if you have a theme, like my theme is being an outsider and regret. If you don't know where your story is going, you're not really efficiently building up to that conclusion with very efficient paragraphs. Like you would never, like I said before, you would never make a logical argument like that. Oh, let me just start describing stuff that I see. Let's see, there's a Smash Brothers controller in front of me with an eraser next to it and a piece of paper. You're supposed to be making an argument about why you like Kirby. Oh shoot, then next to the piece of paper is a random Kirby, and like that's why you can't do that. You have to start from beginning to end, understanding what you're thinking, and then you go from there. You don't just say whatever comes to mind. That's where I believe there's a mismatch between people who don't see the structure in stories and they just think stories are just a whole ad hoc, once upon a time, let me just tell you what's on the top of my mind kind of thing. And the last problem is one of style. I feel like if you don't have enough experience and you just read one kind of like book or watch one kind of movie, there's two things that happen. One, you internalize a lot of the things in that movie. And two, you don't know that you have internalized it. You don't know there's choices. You don't know why they did it necessarily. And you don't know what difference it makes to do or not do that. That's just a complete lack of experience. But it happens because we're all learning and we all start somewhere. Here's the thing that's tricky. You can even see this in some of our Mario Maker levels, right? Some people, when they first started making Mario Maker levels, I need to lean on the camera, their levels were pretty good. They looked like Nintendo levels. They played like Nintendo levels, and they had little issues here and there. But as soon as people needed to make more and more levels, like they would burn out, so to speak. Their ability to continue to make quote-unquote good Nintendo levels quickly evaporated. It's almost as if all that sort of latent energy from playing Nintendo games was expressed in one level. Like all that experience all came together in one level, and that was basically the height of that influence, right? That's the maximum effect that influence could make. And then after that, because they don't want to make the same level twice and they're trying to do something new, they rely on other ideas and other principles and other ways of thinking, and it makes usually people's second or third levels are so different from their first. It's crazy. So it's just a matter of style, having more experience and knowing what the difference is between them, so you can then start making choices because of either how they serve the whole or because you like them and not just because that's all you can think of. And these are the three main problems. And the reason why I wrote this one is writers write because they want to say something. So in the same way that an argument, you make an argument because you want to say something / prove something, in the same way that a system has a character, a function, a behavior, an intent, writers write because they have something to say. They don't write just for exercise, hand exercise, to watch their calligraphy. They don't write, I presume, good ones don't, for any of those reasons. They write because they have something to say. And it's no coincidence that having something to say is like having an argument, having something in your mind that you feel like you have to put together in order to convey. And when you convey it, there's some truth, some distilled, overarching theme or takeaway that happens because of it. And that's what, if you could say that in one word, if I could convey to you the entirety of Harry Potter in one word, I'd say that word. One word can't do it. If I could do it in 2 words, I'd do it. A page, a chapter, you can't do it. So all those things are in service of conveying this one super complex, very nuanced, but still very singular idea. And that's how I describe writers, why they write and what they do when they write. And I feel like some people aren't writing because they don't write because they have nothing to say. They're just writing because they like stories and they like reading. And that's why I was saying to Bleach earlier. Appreciating something on the one hand is great. And then trying to make it is a whole other can of worms. It's difficult. There's a lot of discipline involved, a lot of learning. I really wish there was a more middle ground thing where people could go from really liking a thing and not necessarily having to make something like it and fail just to appreciate it, but something in between. I don't know, maybe discussing it and engaging in criticism would be that middle thing. I don't know, gameplay critique. I mean, we've been doing this concept for 10 years now. That's why it's so disheartening to see people make that jump and stumble and fail, because that jump is too big. You need to work your way into it. You need to learn how to discuss things. You need to learn how to think for yourself. You need to learn how to keep these concepts individual in your head. You got to start talking before you start writing, walking. I don't know. Cool. So now we're going to close on the Little Mermaid thing. I probably should just see the Little Mermaid thing for another stream, but I want to do it. I've been waiting so long. We'll see if I can wrap it up in 15 minutes. So here are the lyrics. If you guys need the link or whatever, or you can just imagine Ariel singing it, or you want to click over to the stream, just do so and let me know. But we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to reflect on everything we just talked about in the context of this Little Mermaid. There's 2 scenes. They take a few minutes to watch. Here we go. Don't flag me, YouTube. And if YouTube flags all this, then